Well, my career as an academician and a critic of poetry began many years ago. My PhD work happened to be on a group of British poets of the 1950s, popularly called the movement poets, amongst whom the most prominent is, of course, Philip Larkin. So this work was done over a period of 5 years between 1972 and 78. And then I kept it aside for a while. When I came to Hyderabad to join the University of Hyderabad, I found that it was time for me to publish that thesis. And I went to Oxford for a year's postdoctoral work and then fine-tuned this dissertation with the help of my teacher and mentor, Professor John Carey, then the Merton Professor of English Literature at Merton College, Oxford. So this book finally appeared in 1989, a good decade after I had written it as a PhD student. It's been reasonably well received and cited quite frequently because not many people in India work on the genre of poetry as such, and certainly when it comes to British poetry, there is not much of a fashion or a vogue. As a kind of a supplement to this, or as a complement to this, a few years later, and partly because of the exigencies of teaching in the University of Hyderabad and the availability of large amounts of material on American literature in the then ASRC, what is called the American Studies Research Center, I produced another book, and this time with the help of a Fulbright scholarship, where I went to Amherst College and finally published that book called A Difficult Balance, a study of contemporary American poetry. So that appeared in 1992. Since then, my attitude has been one of a broad grounding in poetry of various cultures, but also there has been a pressure, internal pressure I must say, on me to try and move away from the world out there to the world within and to the world around me. And that means worrying more and more about India, Indian culture, Indian literature, and more particularly Indian English poetry. My teacher and mentor in India, the legendary Professor C.D. Narasimhaiah, was partly responsible for this move inward. And the point is, of course, that Narasimhaiah was not very sympathetic to Indians discussing English literature or American literature in a vacuum. He was very particular that you should relate what you learnt about Australian poetry or New Zealand poetry or Sri Lankan poetry, American poetry, British poetry to the Indian context. He would often look very disgustedly at some prospective lecturer and put his hand on his head like this and say, what is the Indian relevance of this matter? So that was a very important influence on me, and I began steadily researching Indian writing in English. And by that I mean very strictly writing originally done in English. I recognize the importance of translation, of course, and in a country like ours, which has so many languages and so many literatures, it is very necessary for us to know what is happening in distant Punjab or in Calcutta or in the Northeast or closer home in Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, even though you may be located in Hyderabad. And how will you do this except through a reference to translation and translated materials? Everyone recognizes how difficult translation is as an activity, and everyone also understands that there's a lot of profit and there's a lot of loss in the act of translation. You can never have a one-to-one correspondence with the original language. At the same time, we have to accept what we have, but then demand that translators take their job much more seriously than they have. Sometimes because it's a fashion now, and it's also a money-making proposition, there are translators galore, and many of them don't have the necessary intellectual equipment to do this job. So I have been very concerned about that aspect in my critical work. Having said this, the writings I have done in the last few years have concentrated a great deal on Indian materials. And in 2010, as a result of a very unique kind of conference I organized at the University of Hyderabad, where I invited a dozen poets, only 10 turned up finally. I had 10 interlocutors, something like Tim Sebastian's Hard Talk in the BBC. And so it was not a conference in the usual manner, where you read papers and then have interminable discussions which perhaps lead to nothing finally. But here was a concrete instance of bringing to Hyderabad University 10 prominent Indian English poets. And I thought that was a very important and significant step I had taken in this whole business of engagement with poetry in general and, of course, Indian poetry in particular. Amongst the poets called were, of course, Nissim Ezekiel, but he was too ill to come. So the senior-most poet who did turn up was our own Shiv K. Kumar, who today is about 91 years old and is still busy writing books. The latest book which he's published is on the Mahabharata, a completely beautiful prose version, his own version of the great Indian story. So he was one of our poets. Amongst the others were K.K. Derawala came, Menka Shivdasani came, G.J.V. Prasad came, Makaran Paranjape came, and I can't list everybody, but there are about 10 of these poets. And this seminar took place in 2000, in March 2000. And it was a Sahitya Academy sponsored activity. So there was a lot of money available from the Sahitya Academy to put this material into print. But then we didn't have the technology in 2000, or at least I was not competent enough, I still am not in terms of technological matters, to transcribe these interviews directly into the computer. I believe there are ways in which this can be done now without the kind of hard, manual transcribing which we had to indulge in. So two of my colleagues, Pramod Nair and Afifa Banu, helped me to transcribe all the interviews which we had recorded, and then we sent all these transcriptions back to the poets. And this happened about 3-4 years later, after the interview itself, after the seminar itself took place. Now the poets were, of course, very critical, and many of them wanted to revise what they had said in 2000. I said there's no problem. When we are trying to publish a book, it should be as contemporary as possible. It's after all contemporary Indian English poetry, and the 10 poets were very generous in reading the transcripts, correcting them, adding new material or relevant material to the questions which were put to them by the interlocutors. So this entire thing took about 3 or 4 years for us. Manual, difficult job. Poets being very temperamental, they take their own time over things. They didn't send back things in time. Others were silent for long periods. You had to pursue them. Finally, we got it done. I think that was the most exciting part of the project, the engagement with the poets themselves. Then Pramod, Afifa and I decided that we would do a long 3-part introduction. I took care of early Indian English poetry, Torudat, Derozio, that set in the 19th century. Afifa Banu took care of the middle period, that is between, shall we say, the beginning of the 20th century and a point at which Ramanujan, Ezekiel and Parthasarathy became active, which was sometime near the 1950s. And then Pramod Nair, who has been doing a lot of reviewing of very, very contemporary poetry, wrote the last part, the 3rd part of the introduction. We called it Introduction 1, Introduction 2, Introduction 3. And then after these 3 long introductions, which would be useful for any general reader of Indian English poetry, which contextualizes all the work, we had author introductions for each one of the poets represented in our volume. And then their interviews were transcribed or at least printed. But I thought of another idea. Why should this not also become an anthology? Why only interviews? So during the interview, they talked about their poems, sometimes they read their poems. In fact, at least half a dozen poems were read by each one of the poets. But without being too close to the original event, fidelity to the original was not necessarily a virtue for us. We said, okay, if the poet is making a certain point, we'll look at a poem which seems to substantiate what he or she is saying, and we'll print that poem. So as the interview is going on, we also have these poems printed. So it becomes interviews, introductions, and anthologies, followed by a very, very comprehensive bibliography of work done on Indian English poetry. So this book is available in the outlets of the Sahitya Academy, and I would consider this one of the most important jobs I have done personally. And the poets are all very happy with the work. I was particularly worried about their reception of the book, and they were all very happy. But I have not heard much from the critics, because the Sahitya Academy is a problem. It doesn't really send books for review in time. I have had to get it reviewed in a couple of places, and they've done reasonably good and sympathetic interviews. But a full-scale review of a book is what one wants, and authors must have that. And I think if it is possible for books to be presented on television as we are doing today, and on some other multimedia forum, I think books will get known better, and that's, I think, a very, very important step forward. It's a very good question. Indian English poetry began on a rather traditional note, imitative note, and some of our early poets like Toru Dutt and Derozio, Manmohan Ghosh, and so on, used traditional literary forms like the form of the ballad, the form of the ode, the lyric, and the narrative poem, and so on. And they also dealt with material which was for them very important, Indian materials, because they were living at a time when English education had been introduced into India, and many of them were the products of that English education as well. And therefore, there was a little conflict in their minds between Anglicization and Westernization, and the need to also preserve something of their own native culture. So a poem like The Lotus by Toru Dutt is an excellent case in point. The lotus, as we all know, has tremendous resonances in the Indian mind. When we talk of someone passing away, we say, so-and-so has attained to the lotus feet of the Lord. And in most of the iconic representations of Indian gods and goddesses, you find most of them either sleeping on a lotus or standing on a lotus, which is, I think, very symbolic of the steadiness of the mind which human beings should have. Also, the lotus, as we all know, grows in very slimy conditions, in ponds and rivers where there's a lot of filth and slime. And it is extraordinary that a lotus which is so beautiful can blossom in the middle of all this filth and all this muck and not get affected by the muck. You pour some water on a lotus, the water just falls off and it's dry as it was before the water fell on it. This, for Toru Dutt, was very clearly symbolic of the manner in which human beings should live in this world. We should be of this world, in this world, but not of this world. Something like a Bhagavad Gita detachment is involved. So my view is that Toru Dutt was writing a poem where she was trying to bring out all these multiple levels of meaning, and in a sonnet of 14 lines, she's been able to suggest so much. And this is what Dr. Johnson, speaking of 18th century English poetry, called strong sense. Poetry with strong sense. Just as we like strong coffee, a good decoction, or a strong tea, we have strong sense, where in the space of a few words, a huge amount of meaning is generated. So that is Toru Dutt. And I'll not, of course, talk about all the poets, but Derozio is important. He was, of course, a very radical poet. He was part of the Young Bengal movement. And he was one of those who taught at Hindu College, which is now called Presidency University in Calcutta. It was founded in 1817. And he was one of the early dons, influenced by the French Revolution, having all kinds of radical ideas, and certainly interrogating the Hindu-Indian past. So he got hold of all these Bhadralok children who wanted a good English education. They all came to Hindu college, and there Desrosiers gave them information and values which were so completely opposed to what the Hindu families would have liked. And therefore, the Bhadralok began to get affected by this. They felt that their children were suddenly losing their roots, and they were drinking wine and eating beef, and this was something completely taboo and unacceptable to the higher upper class Bengali families. So they got together, and I think the governors finally dismissed Desrosiers from the college. But the poems which he wrote are all about the blossoming of India, like, for example, The Harp of India, or To the Pupils of Hindu College, where he's constantly talking about the great music which India did have at one time, which needs to be revived now. And he looks upon these students as the harbingers of the future, where they will, in a sense, strum the same music which has now suddenly gone dead. And I think he is, in fact, in a way, anti-colonial in his own fashion, except that he's writing in English. He's a product of English education. He's very much a product of English modernity. At the same time, he has this strong sense of India having to get back its pristine state of purity. So if you look at poetry as it went down the ages, you have writers like Aurobindo Ghosh, for example. Now, if you don't know Aurobindo's philosophy, it's very difficult to understand the poetry. And it is turgid and splendid in its long periods, orotund in its sentences, and it has imagery and symbolism which, unless you're an initiate, you will not be able to follow. But even Aurobindo managed to communicate a sense of India's spiritual traditions through his extremely well-known work. Savitri, for example, is a great allegory of modern India. It is to this kind of grandiloquent verse that P. Lal and some of the Indian modernists reacted in the 1940s and 50s. P. Lal and I think Raghavendra Rao put together a long anthology of work by various Indian poets of the 1950s and 40s and the 50s. And they wrote a long introduction, and P. Lal is basically responsible for this. He said that the age of sentimentality is over. We need now a hard and dry poetry of our own. He was, of course, echoing what the Imagist said about 30 years earlier. In India, everything happens 30 years late. And I think the modernity of the Indian English poetic tradition is a kind of a throwback to the modernity of the Imagist poets of the 1920s. About 20 years later, we find our poets reacting to Aurobindo and saying that Aurobindo is somewhat like Swinburne, right? A verse which is not concrete, not something which you can hold on to, and doesn't seem to have the kind of specificity which modern poetry requires. So that specificity comes in Nissim Ezekiel, R. Parthasarathi, who wrote Rough Passage, and A.K. Ramanujan, who wrote a poem like A River. I'm just giving you one or two small instances to show you that this is a poetry which is modern, which is specific, which is imagistic, which has a wonderful ironic sense of reality. When Ramanujan talks about Brahmins shivering and uttering their hymns, he calls it the shivering hymns of the Brahmins. Expressions like this gives you a sense of a whole world of experience, but beautifully imaged in the space of one or two words or one or two word pictures. Of course, Professor Nadkarni, who is an Aurobindonian, said that these are all lean and hungry poets, these modernists, and they don't have the width and the breadth and the fullness of Sri Aurobindo. So this debate has been going on for a long time, and Sri Aurobindonian verse is something which continues to be in vogue in India, in amongst many, many poets who still have spiritual longings. So where you have something like a religious bent of mind, you tend to follow the Aurobindonian line, not necessarily using that kind of language, not necessarily using words which are sometimes difficult to understand, or images which are not available to the ordinary reader, but in more modern verse. That we have a lot of poets like that. And I think Makaran Paranjape is a good example of that kind of a poet with a spiritual bent of mind, but writing very modern verse. But people like Ramanujan, Nissim Ezekiel and Parthasarathy have in a sense had the day, and they are the ones who have initiated what we might call modernity. Coming to the later part of the 20th century and early part of our 21st, we have Sudeep Sen, who produced an anthology of modern Indian poets. And it's called Lines Poets because he used to edit an anthology called the Lines Anthology with some Scottish money and all that, in which he put together another 12 or 13 very contemporary poets who were writing about all kinds of things, including exile and home. That is, in Tagore's expressions, Ghore, Baire, home and abroad. Because the great reality of the 20th century and our own century is displacement. Nobody, even in India, is necessarily living in the place where he or she was born. We are always moving into some other part of the country in search of our livelihood. I myself was born in Calcutta, though I am not a Bengali. I am Tamil. I lived in Calcutta for nearly 11 years, had education in Bangalore, came to Chennai for my university education, and I found a job, went for a PhD into Rajasthan, and I am now living in Hyderabad with practically no connections with my original, place of birth or even the culture from which I have sprung. Because we have Palakkad Ayers, people who come from Palakkad or the Kerala region, Tamilians who lived in Kerala. So, I mean, hybridity and the lack of anything like an essential spirit, anything like a pure culture is now the fact of life in India and abroad. And our own poets are not living in India also. Many of them live abroad. At least every second poet I can think of is someone who has one leg in New York and one leg in Delhi, or lives for 6 months in London or 6 months in Hyderabad, whatever. Many of these poets, therefore, talk of the diasporic consciousness. And that is an important theme in Sudeep Sen's Lines Anthology, which distinguishes it from Mehrotra's 12 modern Indian poets, which OUP brought out in the 1980s. Mehrotra, of course, was opening up people like Ramanujan and Nissim Ezekiel and Parthasarathy and himself to the public view. And they represent what I might call the old modernists or the elderly modernists. But we have younger modernists like Sudeep Sen himself and Chitra Divakaruni, who also writes novels, and a number of others who are all represented in the Lines Anthology. And many of them are represented in the long introductions we have in that volume which I talked about, which I have edited. And I would say that contemporary Indian English poetry is quite healthy. There are many people who say that it's not possible for you to write in English, definitely not write poetry in English when you don't have it as your mother tongue. I am a little skeptical about this kind of nativism. I am proud of my Tamil heritage, proud of my culture. All that is fine. But we can't be so narrow as to imagine that no writing is possible in a language not your own. Joseph Conrad was not an Englishman, but he wrote excellent English. Vladimir Nabokov is Russian, but he wrote in English. And you think of many American writers whose origins are not English or Anglo-Saxon, who wrote wonderfully well. And today, a whole lot of Caribbean writers live in Britain who write poetry in English. And in India too, we have a large number of poets who write in English. Ramanujan has a very fine statement to make about this. He speaks about his own poetry, how for him, and remember that Ramanujan was a linguist and an anthropologist and a great sociologist. He lived in Chicago for a good part of his life, moving from Mysore, where he graduated. And his professional disciplines gave him, as he called it, the outer form of his poetry. But the inner form of his poetry, the inscape, as Hopkins would put it, comes from his engagement with Tamil literature, Sangam poetry of Tamil culture, Sanskrit literature, Kannada Vachana poetry, and the great Tamil Shaivite and Vaishnavite Bhakti poetry of the Alvars and the Nayanmars. Remember that Ramanujan wrote hymns for the drowning, which are his version of the poetry of the great Alvar poets, who are the Bhakti poets of the Vaishnava tradition. And hymns for Shiva are poems which he's written, his own version of the Nayanmar poetry. And therefore, inner and outer merge in Ramanujan. And I think that is more or less the condition of most poets who are writing today, because they also have a commitment to their mother tongue or to the languages which they have learned. And sometimes many of us are polylinguistic. I mean, we are, what do you call that, people with multiple linguistic skills. A child growing up in a university campus like mine can learn Telugu, which is the local language, Tamil, which is spoken at home, Hindi, which is known to everybody, English. In addition, he or she can pick up an additional language like Kannada or Malayalam because of friends who come from those regions. So this capacity, polyglottism, right, the word polyglot, I think Ramanujan is gesturing towards the possibility that poets who want to write now are necessarily, in a sense, polyglots. Even in our own conversation, while we speak in Hindi, we suddenly move into English. And as we are speaking in English, we use Hindi words or Telugu words. It's happening all the time. Therefore, there's nothing pure about language anymore, even though we might like to talk about the purity of Hindi or purity of Telugu or Tamil or anything like that. So the inner form and the outer form merging produces for you a tapestry, a wonderful palimpsest. And I think writing in English today in India is basically an acknowledgement of these multiple linguistic identities. I am what I often call myself an occasional poet. I find that I sometimes sit in a seminar hall, get completely bored with all the academic discussions, and write a poem for the occasion. So I have written many poems about seminar culture, about our inability to keep to the point, and how people exactly at 5 minutes to 1, when lunch is about to be served, get on to a long discussion and prolong the session for a long time. So I have a kind of skeptical attitude to academic life itself. Of course, the poems I am going to now read are not about those things, but about my own personal reflections on life. There are 2 poems which I want to read. One I have simply called Untitled. We could not speak, friend, but the twitching of your eyes, the familiar pouting of your lips, the barely suppressed smile, matching the bare arms whose hairs I knew, caused a pain in my heart, and the tears flowed, respectful of your space, regretful of betrayal, hopeful of a future when we would maintain the usual pregnant silence. I have another poem on my grandfather, who had a house, a large palatial house in Kerala, and a 10-acre property. I went back to see it a few years ago and found to my shock that the main house is available, but the entire property has been parceled off into small plots, and houses have been built all over the place, destroying forever the pastoral beauty of the farm where I grew up. Sometimes during the summer vacations I used to visit my grandfather. In 1962 he fell very ill, and we were planning to take him back to Calcutta where we were at that time. But before that event occurred, he died. But the death occurred 3 months after he sold this wonderful property, partly because of his inability to negotiate. He sold it for a very throwaway price, a distress sale, which today at 85,000 then would cost you, I think, 85 lakhs, if not more than that now. Anyway, this is grandfather who occupied 10 acres. Grandfather occupied 10 acres, arable, odoriferous, plentiful. Bananas, jackfruit, paddy. Rode to a bathing ghat of the Periyar River, now parceled out in Newtonian fashion. The acres are worth millions. No integrity anymore. Custom and ceremony gone. Grandpa shuffled off his mortal coils in nearby Thrissur, broken by short selling and disease and filial aggression. This is work which I have done for the last 25 years. I wrote, as I said, occasionally, and I have not been a sustained poet in the sense that sitting down in a disciplined way and writing poetry every day. But my engagement with poetry has been long because I've been reading poetry all my life. And therefore, whenever I feel the urge, I write a poem. Or sometimes I'm walking around and I get the urge and I can't write because I don't have a pen or a book in my hands. So I have to come back and then write this poem, and the initial impulse is lost. So I believe I should be carrying with me, as Thomas Hobbes did when he wrote the Leviathan, pen and ink and book with me wherever I go. But be that as it may, I have been able to write quite a lot over the last 20-25 years. But I never took courage in my hands to publish much of this, because I always felt that there were other poets who were so good and whose work was so superior that I felt a little intimidated. But then I said at some point, you've got to break away from this kind of, regretful, restraint. And I published. And I published in several forums now. And I have quite a number of poems, not only in print, but also in manuscript form. So I'm putting this together. It will probably I might be able to bring out 2 volumes, because there's enough poetry here for 2 volumes. Assuming that something like 50 pages would be a standard size for a book, something like the volumes brought out by Writers' Workshop, about 50-60 pages, which roughly means 50 to 60 poems, or a little more than that. I think I have work here for 2 volumes. Definitely one of my volumes will be called My Son's Father Confessor, because I want to convey to my son my feelings. But I can't sometimes talk to him directly because they're so impatient these days. So maybe writing it in print will help me to memorialize whatever I wanted to say, which I have not been able to say directly. So My Son's Father Confessor is going to be the title of one of the volumes. The other volume I have not yet titled. They could simply be early impressions or first impressions or something like that. I have not decided. But by the end of this year, I think both should be out, or at least one of them should be out.